So this is a critical autoethnography, and as I said, it's my very first one. I started it right when COVID started. Took a year and a half, just a journal article. And it's an account of my experiences as a woman of color academic at predominantly white institutions in the times of COVID and the consequential turn to online teaching and learning. It reflects on how the pandemic has exacerbated my experiences of discrimination, marginalization, isolation, and the struggle to find a balance between my life, my personal and my professional identities. I wrote and rewrote this autoethnography while sitting at my dining table in my 50-meter square flat, where I spent most of the COVID lockdown. In writing, I felt compelled to reflect on my feelings of apprehension, anger, frustration, and exhaustion. In only a few months of my appointment as a permanent lecturer in British higher education, a first appointment I get, the system just faced a sudden transition to remote teaching and learning because of COVID. So the story I tell here is about my experience during the pandemic, but for you to understand these experiences, I must first tell my stories of my story of my experience before the pandemic. In many ways, my struggle as a woman of color academic mirror many who preceded me, and certainly many who will follow me. But my journey also has its unique constituents, which I present here. I'm an early career academic whose workload includes teaching, supervising dissertations, writing academic articles, taking on the responsibility for a heavy load of administrative work and student personal tutoring. At the time of writing this article, I was also a student finishing my PhD corrections. So I just submitted my PhD. I just finished my Viva at the time. And I was also studying for postgraduate diploma of academic practice, BGCAP. I'm also a single mother whose duties include maintaining a household on a single person salary and nurturing a teenage girl. And I'm also a migrant worker, a status that results in being barred from access to public funds like child support, tax relief, and more. So since I don't have the slides, I'm just going to tell you that I'm going to talk a bit about the autoethnographic process, which was horrendous for me at the beginning, because I really wanted to write about myself, but I found it really hard not to share with others. I'm an open book, but I found it really hard sometimes to tell myself that this is happening to me. So just putting it on paper meant admitting it, and it was really hard at times. So why critical autoethnography? Because for me, it distinguishes between autoethnography that focuses on the self and autoethnography that captures the reflexive approach with which cultural and institutional contexts are also examined. Let me cite Robin Boylan and Mark Orb here. They explain that critical autoethnography combines three aspects of critical theory: to understand the lived experiences of real people in context, and to examine social conditions and uncover oppressive power arrangements, and to fuse theory and action to challenge processes of domination. I draw on this critical autoethnography to engage the complex ways in which my identity could be understood through the explorations of intersectionality. As an analytical tool, intersectionality ensures that social divisions are not examined as isolated cases, but as factors that influence one another, because many times women of color, these disadvantages that women face, they sometimes being looked upon as only from a gender perspective or only from a race perspective. And because many of those who interact with me daily have often doubted my ability to make claims about my own experiences and knowledge, like, for example, are you sure this happened to you? Are you sure you're not exaggerating? Oh, you're too sensitive. Because of that, I present my story as a subjective truth, which represents ongoing theoretical interpretations of my reality as a woman who lives it. and trying to understand it myself. I came to academia after a long journey of gender-based activism in Egypt, founded on a personal story. As a result of daring to speak against Sharia, I was labeled Western, infidel, loose, reckless, anti-Muslim, and more. This was precisely what brought me to academia. Fighting for gender equality became a matter of life or death to me. That I abandoned my former career as an interior designer, pursued postgraduate studies in gender, and devoted my life to fighting gender-based violence. I volunteered for several NGOs, attended conferences around the Middle East, wrote blogs, opinion and articles, and so on. I vowed to continue the battle. And in 2016, I moved to the UK to pursue my PhD in gender and social policy. Ultimately, what I really wanted was to write, because writing is a political act, a way of reclaiming power. And this is cited, by the way. And finding my own voice as well. I remember going to the British Library when I first arrived, standing in the middle of this courtyard, spreading my arms and saying, I will cherish this opportunity and promise to work as hard as I can. I thought at the time that because I have succeeded in securing a PhD scholarship, I'd be able to write freely and unrestricted. Ironically, I harnessed the same institutional narrative of individual lean-in that I'm actually now criticizing. I have inherited the belief that I could become prosperous entirely based on individual merit. I was wrong. It was here in the UK that I understood the meaning of racial disparity. It was here that I learned the significance of intersectionality. And it was here that I realized that not only my gender, but my race, as well as my motherhood, were all linked to my identity. Only then did I begin to understand that the assumptions others held about me, which include but not restricted to my gender, would carry consequences. And during these early years, as a PhD researcher, in many instances, I was ignored. In situations where my presence and contributions should have been acknowledged, I was not seen by colleagues as an authoritative, legitimate knowledge producer. My supervisor would tell me, post-colonial feminism, is this even a theory? Narrative method? Does it really matter? I have experienced both hypervisibility due to looking different, speaking different, and thinking different, and invisibility due to being dismissed as a result of these differences. At times, I thought I was paranoid, observing what I now understand to be examples of microaggressions. This left me concerned of whether I was the cause of or imagining my own mistreatment. I was positive that my experiences would eventually be different. I was wrong again. From being told to go home by administrative staff to being advised to downplay the racial and gendered aspects of my research by my supervisor, who actually told me they seem self-indulgent and exaggerated. This PhD is not about you. And my response was, actually, it is about me. In August 2019, after 2 months of marathon of job applications while editing my final PhD thesis, I was shortlisted for a permanent lectureship. I was flattered. Soon after entering my dream job, I realized that not too much was going to change in the way I was treated. In my new appointment, I was thrown into a deep sea the day I started my job, being actually required to teach on the very first session that was supposed to be my induction. I was already doing more than other colleagues, hired on a higher pay, despite—
And we're just at 9 minutes now, okay.
I understand. Despite having less qualifications. And despite having queried several times about the justification for my lower pay to both my seniors and HR personnel, I never received a clear explanation. Honestly, I didn't take a formal approach because I thought I should suppress my anger and not being looked upon as shrill, loud, hostile, aggressive, and so on. All this has been exacerbated due to lockdown, due to online teaching, which made it easier for students to bully me online while being not on camera, not on and not on voice. It was much easier for my colleagues to ignore me in team meetings. Exhausted has become my commonplace, in addition to million tasks hidden under the category of teaching. And I'll fast forward a bit and talk a bit positive now about survival. But I must say that survival was not always my principal mode of living. Before I came to the UK, I was middle class. I had a middle class upbringing, loving family, master's degree in the best university in the country. So I only started to understand survival when I came here. Acknowledging the emotional labor that women academics must endure, I accept that being an agent of change may sometimes involve taking on additional commitments, so I sort of accept that now. But for an ongoing and open dialogue to take place, women of colour academics must be at the heart of it, structuring the course of action to tackle the challenges they face. It is a familiar experience for women of colour as academics to be asked how you made it through within this context of racism and sexism. And I know that I've talked about negatives more than positives, but I would like to end up by celebrating being able to challenge the dominant meaning of success in the academy, the norms of what it means to be a successful academic, including how we dress, how we speak, how we behave, the topics we study, the research methods we use. And I will end up by reading my motto by Audre Lorde from my slides. If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hind. Nandini, if I can just invite you up here. Are you okay to sit? Yeah, it seems the microphone works better if seated down. So move out your way.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here in a physical room, even though it's sweltering and we're all melting. But I want to start with a small disclaimer that I'm going to go in a slightly different direction from the abstract I wrote. This was not planned, and it is what came up in the writing. And I think I've started thinking about what I wrote in my abstract about Russia and Ukraine and how that reminds me of my brownness, but then also about roaming and what roaming means in the context of brownness and methodologically, paradigmatically, and also ethically. How can we think of roaming ethically? I'm going to start with something that I've written, and then I'm going to wing it slightly after that. It was a slow Thursday morning, the kind of day that begins with the cracks and aches of a heavy, busy week, stumbling towards the slight relief of the weekends. Were we just coming out of the Omicron wave? Or maybe yet another announcement about ongoing lifting, whatever restrictions in Scotland? I can't remember what exactly I was doing that day, but I can remember being hit by the sense of absolute dread as the news of Russia's attack on Ukraine flooded in through the screens. It settled deep in my gut. The kind of impending doom, the hyper-awareness that comes with collective trauma, and that comes with the talk of a potential world war, unraveling over the next few weeks into the entangled threads of grief, rage, and hopelessness. But my anger and sadness were not just for those fleeing the senseless violence that was destroying lives in Ukraine. I suppose as each day passed and the world erupted with support for Ukraine, I should have felt hope and relief. And mind you, I did feel some hope and some relief for the systems that were being put in place. My anger and despair also came from the exacerbated awareness of my own brownness in a primarily white part of the world. Who is allowed to roam? Who is allowed to flee? And who is relegated to roaming? Who is allowed to live? What are non-bodies worth in times of war? How much do they matter? They're surely not deemed worthy of the cost of Eurostar travel to the countries that they're fleeing to. They're probably also not worth the sanctions countries are willing to impose when, To quote the Bulgarian Prime Minister, the CBS correspondent, and the BBC reporters, intelligent, educated, civilized people with blue eyes and blonde hair, or countries that are not used to war every day, are at risk. How much will my brownness allow me to roam? Or rather, how much does my lack of whiteness constrain me if I have to run, escape, find safety? There's something colonizing about this. I'm interrupted by a sudden visceral awareness of my own skin here. Skin as something that creates boundaries, but not the boundaries of safety or containment. Maybe what makes me feel hopeless here is that skin, ethnicity, and my nationality will always produce those boundaries of how much I matter, where I get to go, and where I'm allowed to roam. But this is not news to me. It is not unfamiliar. It is something I've always known. It might be the unraveling of grief, rage, and hopelessness that now makes my brownness leak, spill forth, and viscerally it categorizes me as the other, who might not matter as much, or who might only matter in particular ways. But how I matter and what comes to matter with and in my entanglements within this world, it is always colored some shade of brown, as much as I drape myself in the whites of the world. It is not only the physical borders of a boundary divided world that I'm feeling effectively right now, but it's also the boundaries and tensions of roaming and the right to roam. Who has that privilege? Who does that gatekeeping in research, in life? I know the privileges I hold, being here in UK, being an international student, in a department that is driven by the relational, creative, and expansive kind of work. But still, I'm part of the lauded academy and the structural mires that comes with it. These spaces where I belong, yet don't fully belong. It is messy. I move between the black and white spaces, leaking into the in-between. I belong enough to know the damage that I too can cause in becoming a part of the Eurocentric, colonizing politics that we all intentionally or unintentionally fall prey to. In our activisms, in our practices, in research, and in thinking of roaming. I'm going to take a moment here. I had something else written, but I actually want to share some of the responses that I've had since yesterday, since being here, about roaming. I step back into the questions of who is allowed to roam, where do we roam, but also what are the ethics of roaming. On another Thursday, just after a collaborative writing meeting for my doctoral project, a co-researcher who is also the participant in my doctoral project said to me, "You know that you cannot do your project without employing a decolonial lens, right?" And I think it still stays with me that I, as a brown woman, I cannot do a new materialist project. I cannot do a post-human project without having some kind of post-colonial or decolonial lens to it. I'm a woman of color. I'm engaged in a new materialist research project about a collective of other Indian women. When does roaming become unethical here? And what does the roaming do? I think this is what I'm staying with right now. Since yesterday, since listening to the talks here, what does roaming do? How do we inquire into the ethics of roaming? Do we just roam? Is it okay to roam anywhere? Where are the boundaries for that? My brownness makes me aware of the boundaries of where I cannot roam, but also maybe the boundaries of where we should not be roaming. I have no answers that I've arrived at here. This is messy, it's unfinished and unresolved. But I want to leave you with more questions. Are all boundary crossings and boundary blurrings ethical? What stories do I tell in places where roaming is privileged? What stories do I tell of people who don't have the privilege of roaming? To cross a boundary is a privilege. To blur a boundary is also a privilege. Much like being stopped at the borders, my brownness too stops me as I run towards the new. It demands that I stop before I commit to a stance that promises a world so fluid, and we all want that, and I want that. But I also have to acknowledge that the boundaries that are always inevitably drawn and cannot be erased exist, and they won't go away just because we might imagine a different world. So maybe for me, it's not the right to roam, but it's the privilege of roaming that we need to start inquiring into. Thank you.